I will end every single international crisis that the current administration has created, including the horrible war with Russia and Ukraine, which would have never happened if I was president, and the war caused by the attack on Israel, which would have never happened if I was president. Iran was broke. Iran had no money. Now Iran has $250 billion. They made it all over the last 2.5 years. They were broke.
It occurred to me recently that the conservative movement doesn't really have a foreign policy anymore. It has now been 16 years since any mainstream Republican has held the White House, and almost all of the high-ranking people from the Bush administration have retired. And Trump alienated all the mainstream figures who worked for him the first time. There are just no Republicans with high-level foreign policy experience anymore. All that's left is the fringiest dregs of neoconservatism and the pseudo-isolationism of the Pat Buchanan right. And you could say, well, Trumpism is the foreign policy of the Republicans now, and it doesn't matter if it meets your personal definition of expertise. Who's to say Hulk Hogan can't be Deputy Secretary of Defense for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs? He defeated the Iron Sheik. But what is Trumpism?
I think a lot of people in the media have been saying, oh, we're making plans for the second term. I think our plans include Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I've been telling my European friends where I travel that are concerned, what does the second Trump administration look like? I've been pretty blunt to say it looks just like the first administration.
The main idea seemed to be total autarky, punishing all of our allies, and just kind of hoping Donald Trump's toughness vibes will deter China from invading Taiwan.
When Barack Obama was president, Vladimir Putin invaded Crimea. With Joe Biden as president, Putin invaded all of Ukraine. But when Donald Trump was president, Putin did nothing.
Russia invaded Ukraine under both Obama and Biden. But Putin did not dare escalate under President Trump.
That's specious reasoning, Dad.
Thank you, honey.
By your logic, I could claim that this rock keeps tigers away.
Oh, how does it work?
I don't see any tigers around here, do you?
Lisa, I want to buy your rock.
And he has no backbench to fill in the gaps. The think tanks that were willing to hold their nose and give him a chance in 2016 have run away from him. All except the Heritage Foundation, the think tank that is now infamous for its creation of Project 2025, but even they gutted their foreign policy team because none of their old foreign policy experts wanted anything to do with Trump. The main foreign policy idea on their website now is a white paper about the Chinese using American surrogate mothers to create an army of Chinese sleeper agents with American citizenship. Even Project 2025 itself punts on most issues, except Israel, China, and maybe an invasion of Mexico. What this means is that the entire spectrum of American foreign policy expertise now basically resides under or at least near the Democratic Party umbrella. And at the same time, a lot of the old issues that people used to rally around aren't really relevant anymore. That has made the foreign policy world even more out of touch with voters, who aren't just becoming more partisan, but are also increasingly inhabiting completely different worlds thanks to partisan media. And there's no place where that problem is worse than foreign policy, where people have no personal experience to measure against the media they consume. Fortunately, there is something you can do about that last problem. Ground News is a website and app developed by former NASA engineer Harleen Carr to give readers an easy, data-driven way to read the news. Ground News collects articles from more than 50,000 sources from around the world into one place so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Every story comes with a clear visual breakdown of the bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For instance, take this article on Tony Blinken's interminable quest to broker a ceasefire in Gaza. Ground News found more than 250 articles covering his latest announcement that there's been a breakthrough, and you can see that almost half of the outlets are in the center, and the rest are either center-left or center-right. Like a lot of world news, there's no obvious angle to turn it into a political attack, so the partisan press just ignores it. You can also easily compare headlines. You can see here that Voice of America focuses on the good news of Israel's acceptance, while Gillen's Postin leads with the bad news that Hamas is already saying no. There's also the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum or the other. For example, if you lean left, you probably missed this story that Kamala is requiring all of her campaign staff to get COVID shots. You might not even consider that newsworthy, but what I like about Ground News is that even if you don't think it's newsworthy, It's still useful information to know what the other side is panicking about. And my channel is mostly about trying to figure out what the other side is panicking about now.
I had a Diet Mountain Dew yesterday, and one today. I'm sure they're going to call that racist too.
So you can imagine how much use I get out of it. Go to ground.news/sarcasmatron or click the link in the video description to subscribe today. If you sign up through my link, you'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use to get unlimited access to all their amazing features. I think Ground News is doing important work, and by supporting my sponsors, you're directly supporting my work. So thank you again, Ground News. Now, back to our foreign policy elite. With one party now completely withdrawn from the debate, foreign policy is now less polarized than it was at any point since the Vietnam War. The result of this complete depolarization of foreign policy expertise is that it's increasingly hard to just put people in the old simple categories and predict what they'll do based on that. The neoconservative movement is split between the minority that actually believed in democracy and the majority that was just in it for the dead brown people. The institutions that liberal internationalists wanted to invest in are all discredited. Realists can't agree on whether or not appeasing Russia will reduce Russian aggression, and the anti-imperialist left is hopelessly divided on the question of whether or not imperialism is bad. To predict now what someone will do, you have to tease out not just their basic worldview and affiliations, but their idiosyncratic take on each issue. This makes predictions all but impossible. And with Kamala, that challenge gets even harder because she's left no real record behind to examine. She had no meaningful foreign policy record in the Senate, her 2020 campaign website didn't even have a foreign policy section, and you can only get insight into what she thought about Biden's foreign policy in the scant few times the Biden White House ever leaks to the press. So that leaves looking through the paper trail of her two main foreign policy advisors. Her National Security Advisor and her Deputy National Security Advisor, Philip Gordon and Rebecca Friedman Listner, respectively. Gordon was a think tanker who served as Deputy Secretary of State for Eastern Europe during the Russia reset and then Deputy Secretary for the Middle East during Syria. Both experiences leaving him greatly disillusioned with American power and what it can achieve. Just before joining the Biden administration, he wrote a book about how regime change in the Middle East is basically always a disaster. Rebecca Friedman Listner is a professor at the Naval War College who specializes in grand strategy and who has written a book about how to reorganize the world order now that the traditional liberal international order is no longer viable. Insofar as these categories still matter, they're both basically defensive neorealists, pretending to be liberal internationalists, not unlike Obama. Both have written books about how America needs to stop intervening in the Middle East, and they basically both want to reorient foreign policy around outcompeting China. But what does that really tell us about how they'll handle the specific issues, let alone an unforeseen crisis? I suspect if we want to be able to predict what they're going to do, it might be more useful to look at the circumstances in which they're going to have to work, rather than their internal beliefs. Ukraine is an issue in which there is very little dissent in the establishment about what to do in the broad strokes. Well, there is a little dissent.
We've seen Senator Vance in the past also say that he doesn't really care what happens in Ukraine one way or another. Is that the official Republican stance right now?
First of all, I don't think JD has ever said, I don't care what happens in Ukraine.
And I think the quote was something along the lines of, I don't really care what happens in Ukraine one way or the other, but please.
Well, and talking about funding, but not the people. I mean, he's a very kind person.
But even among people who agree that Ukraine must win, minor tactical differences have blown up in importance. Namely on the question of what weapons to give Ukraine and when. And with the White House so tight-lipped about the issue, people have been filling in the gaps with rumors and speculation. A theory has gotten popular that says Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, has convinced Biden not to give Ukraine the weapons that would allow Ukraine to win the war in fairly quick order because he's worried that if Russia loses precipitously, Russia will hit back with nuclear retaliation. So there's been some excitement in a certain canine corner of the internet that Sullivan will be replaced with someone more hawkish. The problem is that this theory is almost certainly bogus. There's no evidence that Sullivan has been the one pushing back on sending better weapons to Ukraine. And in the few times journalists have gotten people in the White House to talk, they've mostly pointed the finger at Lloyd Austin and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that would track, because that kind of conservatism is now deeply embedded in the culture of the Pentagon, and not so much in the culture of the NSC or the State Department. As far as I can tell, the rumor that Sullivan is the problem was started by writers who had a previously existing beef with Sullivan for reasons too dumb and complicated to explain, and that rumor started getting parroted by NAFO accounts on Twitter who will repeat any rumor for clicks, and then it got picked up by congressional Republicans to deflect attention away from the fact that congressional Republicans were the ones holding up $100 billion in aid money. It really is quite an astonishing example of a fact just sort of being instantiated by people repeating it over and over again on social media with no evidence. There's a misapprehension here on why the White House has held back, because the reason is different for different weapons and at different times, and only a bit of the holdback is about escalation management. For instance, in the early part of the war, the White House didn't want to send advanced weapons because they were working off the assumption that Ukraine would lose, and therefore anything they gave the Ukrainians would get captured. So for instance, a Patriot missile battery would immediately fall into Russian hands, and then the Russians would be able to reverse engineer it. Later, for most ordinary offensive weapons, like say the M1 Abrams, the real reason for America's reticence was not a fear of Russia, but an underestimation. The White House assumed that if Russia took enough casualties, it would give in and sign an agreement to withdraw back to at least the February 21st line. Remember, they gave up on Afghanistan after only 12,000 casualties. It's only after casualties ran up into the six figures with no interruption in domestic peace inside Russia that the Pentagon realized Ukraine might need to win by an offensive rather than by running the clock out. And the Pentagon doesn't know how to arm Ukraine for a successful offensive against Russia without giving Ukraine access to the family jewels of American power, like say, the F-35. There was no fear that sending F-16s and M1s to the front line would trigger escalation from Putin, but a fear that they wouldn't change anything at all. And so, why not spend money elsewhere? When it comes to the ATACMS, however, the White House's decision is about escalation. The ATACMS, after all, are ballistic missiles, not regular rockets that just happen to go further. Though it's important to clarify here what escalation refers to. In this case, what the White House is worried about isn't Ukraine being too aggressive and triggering an immediate nuclear response, but the perception in the Kremlin that America is directly involved, justifying a direct conventional attack on NATO infrastructure in a NATO country. An attack NATO would then have to respond to, possibly snowballing into something bigger. Their estimation of what the Kremlin will do isn't driven by credulously believing what Putin says, but rather strategic empathy. They simply ask themselves, well, if America was at war with Mexico and someone was supplying them with ballistic missiles that were now raining down on downtown Los Angeles, we would probably take the risk of shooting at the supplier. Still, as Ukraine's situation started to look bleaker, people's appetite for risk started to increase. And more people in Biden's White House are willing to take the risk that comes with shooting American ballistic missiles directly into Russia. So who's been the holdout? Well, by most accounts, the person who is standing firm the most is the president himself, not Sullivan. So a change between national security advisors probably won't change much on ATACMS. But a change of presidents might. But no one has leaked even a peep about what side of the fight Kamala is on. Though we know she's in the rooms where this argument is being held, she doesn't say much. I have a gut feeling that Kamala's instinct will be to take on more risk because experience tends to make presidents more risk-averse and more, but ultimately it'll come down to who wins the argument in the Situation Room after she's elected, between a reticent Department of Defense and a more hawkish State Department. And those fights tend to be issues of personality as much as policy. Forget whatever you've read about Middle East strategy. America's unwillingness to confront Israel is about domestic politics. Confronting Israel costs you donors, it costs you voters, it costs you bad press, and every president knows it. Every Israeli prime minister knows it. But there are ways to pressure Israel that won't trigger a big voter backlash. For instance, you can throttle aid deliveries unannounced and have them mysteriously speed up again after the Israelis do what you ask. Biden has allegedly already tried this, but to what effect it's hard to say. Kamala, for her part, is clearly more sympathetic to Palestinians than Biden, but whether that will translate to different policy is hard to say. Real change in Israel policy requires a change in Congress. They set the aid budget. The president does have the power to temporarily cut off aid on human rights grounds through the Leahy Act, but any president would be immediately overruled by Congress and lose all their leverage over Israel when it comes to shaping the long-term post-war settlement. Even though at this point that leverage is so meager it's hard to know if it's worth it. Philip Gordon's record on Israel is promising. He came out against the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem and predicted that just ignoring the Gaza situation would eventually lead to an explosion, not unlike what actually happened. But, as I said earlier, his first commitment is to non-interventionism. And while non-interventionism sounds dovish, there's nothing comforting about having advisors who want to be less involved in the Middle East. In practice, isolationism in the Middle East always means giving the Israelis a blank check and hoping the next explosion goes off after you've left office, since politically that's the path of least resistance. Remember, it's Congress that gives Israel aid. Trying to decouple from Israel means a fight with them. So it's only presidents who really want to meddle in the Middle East that are willing to spend the political capital to put pressure on Israel to negotiate. What that ultimately means is that any change in Israel policy is going to come downstream of a change in the big picture situation in the Middle East, particularly when it comes to America's relationship with
Iran was broke. Iran had no money. Now Iran has $250 billion. They made it all over the last 2.5 years. They were broke.
Iran remains the one country where the traditional conservative-liberal divide has basically survived completely intact. Liberals want to play footsie with the regime moderates and cut a deal. Conservatives want to say, oh, you believe in the JCPOA? That pales in effectiveness to my strategy, doing regime change in Iran, and then not do regime change in Iran. Philip Gordon wasn't one of the main architects of the Iran deal, but he was by far its most vocal defender during the Trump presidency. But that won't necessarily translate into a return to the old deal. When Biden first took over, it was assumed he would follow in Obama's footsteps and re-enter the deal, but by that point, the usual misconnections pattern of Iranian-American relations had intervened. When the moderates were in charge of Iran, America had elected Trump, and when America elected Biden, Iran elected Ebrahim Raisi, the hardline hanging judge. But this time, if Harris wins, her presidency will coincide with the presidency of a moderate again, and one with a popular mandate to make a deal with the Americans, for whatever that's still worth in the Iranian system. But the politics for doing a deal so soon after the brutal crackdown on protesters in 2022, and the October 7th attack, which, fairly or not, Iran is going to be held responsible for, will be difficult. A new comprehensive nuclear deal is probably out of the question either way. Trump's decision to withdraw destroyed America's leverage by splitting the coalition of countries that are meant to maintain the sanctions on Iran. But there are still possible deals to be had on other issues, like Ukraine, Hamas, or the Houthis. Given that, the real question would be something like this. Is a deal to get, for example, the Iranians to distance themselves from Russia and their war in Ukraine worth the grief it would cause from Israel and Saudi Arabia and their incredibly powerful Washington lobbies? Or will America take the easy way out and buy them off by cementing the Israeli-Saudi relationship with more bribes? Even though that will necessarily mean getting ourselves more involved with the region in general. The latter option, which is more likely, doesn't have to be bad, but if the Harris White House does take that path, they will either have to get serious about pressuring Israel back into a withdrawal agreement process, or find themselves in the exact same situation they were in on October 8th, 2023. And speaking of pivots, the spectrum of opinion on China in American foreign policy now stretches from slightly paranoid hostility to psychotic conspiracy theory-tinged hysteria. What divides Trump world from the mainstream is not so much a belief that America will have to go to war with China, but rather a divide between people who think America will have to fight a naval and air war against China for Taiwan sometime in the future, and people who think China is already waging a wildly successful war of sabotage against the United States, a la the Manchurian Candidate. Literally.
The House Oversight Committee launching an investigation into Vice President Kamala Harris's running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, over his long-standing connections to China and CCP-linked entities. Walz has visited China 30 times and even served as a fellow to a Chinese institution devoted to the Chinese Communist Party.
To quote Project 2025, many foreign policy professional and national leaders, both in government and the private sector, are reluctant to take decisive action regarding China. Many are vested in an unshakable faith in the international system and global norms. They are so enamored of them, they can't brook any criticism or reforms, let alone acknowledge their potential for being abused by the PRC. Others refuse to acknowledge Beijing's malign activities, and often pass off criticism as conspiracy theories. The reality, however, is that the PRC's actions often do sound like conspiracy theories. Because they are conspiracies. So, I'm pretty sure this is what 1950 felt like. Like, if you were curious if we're in a Cold War, well, I think you can be sure now. China should be where Kamala's number 2 advisor, Rebecca Friedman Listner, becomes an asset. Keeping up with China is her beat. She wrote a book filled to the brim with policies that would help strengthen America for a fight with China. Policies that will probably never be implemented because you'd need both parties to work together in Congress to get them, but still. But there's a problem. Americans don't really want a strategy to beat China. Trump was able to win by bashing China because after 10 years of American politicians scapegoating the Chinese for a sluggish economic recovery that was really caused by bad macroeconomic policy, the American people were hungry for a fantasy that American decline and deindustrialization were connected and could both be reversed by simple, crude protectionism. Biden and Jake Sullivan have built their foreign policy on the idea that they could double down on that fantasy, but make it less destructive by moving away from tariffs and moving towards massive subsidies. Sullivan has actually been quite explicit that he's doing this because he thinks it's necessary to get the American people to buy into any foreign policy whatsoever.
The thing that every economist would tell you happens, which is overall we win, there are some losers, and we compensate the losers. That's kind of how it goes. Did anyone pause and say, well, did the people who get hurt by these trade deals actually get any compensation or get an opportunity?
What would that even mean?
What would that mean? We just had kind of these small TAA programs and not a lot to it. I totally agree with that. And for me, though, the real reason why that happened more than anything else is this wall between foreign policy and domestic policy. Foreign policy people went out and did the trade deals and didn't look over that wall to say, hey, was the whole thing on the domestic side kind of working out? They just let that not happen for very long.
In other words, what both Trump and to a lesser extent Biden are doing is subordinating real competition to a performance of being tough. And what's effective in power politics bears no relationship with what's effective as security theater. Because the most important thing America needs in any confrontation with China is allies. And that means the sort of unilateral aggression that looks tough on cable news is pretty much always counterproductive. But really, that's every foreign policy problem these days, isn't it? From the imaginary Jake Sullivan plot to sabotage Ukraine, to Biden and Netanyahu's efforts to oust one another while publicly proclaiming their indivisibility, to the decades-long history of partisan chest-beating on Iran that completely ignores the actual problem of Iran, and to finally, the bipartisan commitment to pretending random sporadic acts of protectionism is a China strategy. What's clear is that the world is now so complicated that even relatively sophisticated voters cling to symbolic action and the surface of things. That's why you can say something like this:
I will end every single international crisis that the current administration has created,
and not get left out of the room now. And Harris has taken advantage of this by basically not promising any policy specifics at all. Why would she? Almost anyone who cares about policy specifics is already in her corner. That's fine in the short term, but in the long term, if Republicans continue to nominate completely unserious candidates, and by extension keep giving Democrats the freedom to make no commitments whatsoever, the result will be even less public debate about foreign policy, and an even bigger disconnect between citizens and an already insular foreign policy establishment. And that would be bad, because these people are not as smart as they think they are, and cannot be trusted to be unsupervised. And a special shout out to my patrons, starting with N. Gladstein, Jordan Tile, Poseidon Bowie Torture, Benji Smith, Scurvy Kerr, Insane Vladimir, Aidan Wiley, Rowan Munt or his evil clone, Peter, Cody Rickman, Literally Just Tom, Tiaz, Eric Patterson, Fabian Garden, Uldis, Hadar Milner, Propylane, Kaiser Willie, Mr. Lava Lava, Dracula, Partnior, Hopsan, Kian Hammer, Alex the Social Choice and Voting Theory Nerd, Bobby G, Bear River Vaquera, Archer's Bloody Mary, Laserpig, Learned, Ultra Black, Admiral A, Finn Bortle, Public Loser, Goblin Stack, Lumber Jacques Cousteau, Deadass Reagan, Arjun Von Dahlen, Hisner, Professor Giraffenstein, Creation Scientist, Stylish Hobo, Calvin Garbatik, Dirtlegurg, Ethan Jackson, Clawforce, Ian Woods, Robert Falla, Owen O'Neill, Subphoenix La La La, Daniel B, Dmitro Ponomarenko, Nick T, Artixie, Travis Bennett Video, Pablo Gonzalez, Patrick Bender, ODST Shax, Auto Expert, Uncomfy, Rasmus Hansen, Nathan C. Tupper, Revengeance Musical, Chop Macabre, Glenn Arrow, Jack Bragi, Christoph Kaczynski, Love Letters, Daniel Frey, Metatron, Jennifer McCanna, Gary Oakes Girth, Peyton Miller, Matthias Hoop, Sofastruck, Anthony Gincola, Christopher DeClerc, Methmouth Michelle, Enrico Migliorini, Deadmoo 53, Alexi, Rosie the Cat, Vault Breaker, Tired and Emotional, Cop Creature Shop, Dr. Majalis, Texture, Jacob Thompson, Display GFX, Vicantus Glodinus, Sarah the Crocsune, Chris Hanshu, Beyond, Derek, Gabriel Deards, Jerry Makovsky, 123456789, Peanut Supreme, John Miller, Yang Wei Feng, Game Warrior 010, Totally Useless, Connor Barber, Dustin Walkwood, Heartman, James Lynch, Bernth, Aki665, Old Drippy, Ananas, Taboon, Zoobeers, Watch the Anime Cat Planet Cuties, Null, Alan Wake, That's Good Broth, Aryan I, Garpenlov, Armin Huneberg, Telix V, Carl Nyo, B. Quinn, Sir S, Sean Oscar, Fold Out Chair, Joel Gomez, Gabo Tsai, Scott Beckett, Zach Christensen, Horse Course, Knowing Better, Nate Rice, Tedsville, The Goddess of My Idolatry, Kimma, Spoderman, Aaron, Fogkiten, Jacob Lisi, The Anno, Big Nove, Elia, Diana Banana, and last but not least, Kitten of the Yarn Persuasion.